The train rattled through the countryside, its windows streaked with December rain. Eleanor sat quietly by the frosted glass, a book unopened on her lap. The air was thick with the smell of damp coats and coal smoke drifting from the engine. Around her, passengers spoke in hushed tones, most of them returning home for Christmas. She had chosen this late train to Yorkshire for its stillness, hoping for a peaceful journey before the holiday. Instead, her solitude was broken when a young girl slid into the seat beside her. She had bright eyes, a wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and an eagerness that immediately filled the air. "I hope you don't mind," the girl said with a cheerful smile. "The carriage is rather crowded." "My name is Sophie. I am a student in Leeds." Eleanor offered a polite nod. "Not at all. I am Eleanor. It is good to have company." Sophie's phone buzzed in her hand. She giggled, tapping the screen, then turned it towards Eleanor with the excitement of someone sharing a secret. "Look, this is him. My boyfriend. Perfect, isn't he? He is everything I could ever ask for." The image on the screen made Eleanor's breath falter. A familiar face stared back at her. The sharp jawline, the dark eyes, the faint scar near his temple. Her heart thudded painfully as she realized, this was Edward, her husband of 12 years. For a moment, Eleanor forced herself to remain composed. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a coincidence. But Sophie went on, her voice brimming with devotion. "He is older than me, but he cares for me so much. He makes time for me no matter how busy he is. He even changes his plans just to be with me." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her book. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, though she spoke none aloud. Her husband's frequent absences, his late nights at the office, the trips he claimed were unavoidable, they began to echo back with an ominous ring. As the train roared through the night, Eleanor stared at the image once more. There was no mistake. The man Sophie called her perfect boyfriend was the very man Eleanor had trusted with her life. And now, she was trapped in a carriage with the girl who unknowingly held the key to his secret. The train slowed as it approached a small rural station. Outside, the lamps glowed faintly through the drizzle, casting blurred halos of light across the wet platform. Inside the carriage, Sophie's phone rang. She answered at once, her face lighting up. "Hello, love. Yes, I am on the train. Almost there. You will pick me up at the station." "Perfect." The voice traveled faintly through the speaker, and Eleanor froze. It was Edward's voice. The deep, careful tone he always used when speaking softly to her. The unmistakable sound of her husband. Sophie giggled again, her cheeks flushed. "He is always so thoughtful. He never lets me arrive alone. Even when he is busy, he finds a way. That is what I love about him. He says he cannot bear to be away from me." Eleanor's throat tightened. For years she had believed Edward's excuses, his late-night meetings, his sudden business trips. He would kiss her forehead before leaving, his smile so convincing, his words so polished. And now she heard the same promises whispered to this girl. Sophie lowered the phone and leaned closer, her eyes bright with pride. "He is older, yes, but he is not boring. He is devoted. I know some people might think it is strange, but I have never been happier. He makes me feel like the center of his world." Eleanor forced a smile, though her stomach churned. "That is very fortunate," she murmured. The words tasted like ash. She thought of their 12 years together, of the life they had built in London, of the evenings spent waiting for his return. Was all of it a lie carefully draped in charm? The train lurched forward once more, gathering speed through the night. Sophie scrolled through her gallery, pausing at photographs. "See here. This was our anniversary. 500 days since we met. He took me to a little inn near Whitby. He said it was our special place." Eleanor's heart pounded. That night Edward had told her he was in Manchester on business. She remembered waiting for his call, the silence, the empty bed. And now she saw the truth shining from Sophie's screen, Edward smiling, his arm draped around the girl beside her. Eleanor clasped her hands together to stop them from trembling. The carriage rocked gently, but inside her chest a storm was rising. The pieces of her marriage, once so solid, were beginning to crack. And soon, she realized, there would be no turning back. Rain lashed harder against the train windows, turning the glass into a blur of grey. Eleanor tried to steady her breathing, though each second beside Sophie felt heavier. The girl scrolled through her phone again, her fingers pausing lovingly on picture after picture. "Here we are in Scarborough," Sophie said with a bright laugh. "He booked us a room by the sea. He told me the waves would remind us of how love never stops moving." Eleanor's stomach clenched. She remembered that weekend with bitter clarity. Edward had called her late on a Friday evening, saying a client demanded his presence in Birmingham. She had packed him a bag and kissed him goodbye. Now, in Sophie's gallery, she saw the truth. Edward, relaxed in a fisherman's jumper, his arm tight around Sophie, the sea stretching endlessly behind them. Sophie swiped again, revealing more. Edward at a candlelit table, a glass of red wine in his hand. Edward on a hilltop path, smiling as Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder. Edward at Christmas last year, holding a wrapped box with Sophie's name scrawled on the tag. Eleanor felt her world tip. Each image was a wound, tearing holes in the tapestry of her marriage. She had trusted his stories, believed his explanations. Every absence had been masked by a photograph now glowing in Sophie's palm. Sophie sighed dreamily. "He is the first man who has ever truly seen me. He makes me feel safe, as though I am not just a girl but someone he wants to build a future with. Sometimes he even talks about us living together. Can you imagine?" Eleanor forced her lips into a tight smile. Her hands were trembling now, though she hid them beneath her coat. She wanted to snatch the phone, to smash it, to erase the evidence of betrayal that burned before her eyes. But she stayed still, listening. The train thundered through the darkness, carrying her further from certainty and deeper into a truth she could no longer ignore. Each flick of Sophie's finger across the screen was another knife to Eleanor's chest. And then Sophie whispered, almost shyly, "I think he may be the man I marry." Eleanor's heart stopped. For in that moment, she knew the life she had built, the vows she had spoken, and the man she had loved were all slipping into someone else's hands. The train screeched as it pulled into York Station, brakes grinding against the rails. Passengers stirred, gathering coats and bags, preparing to step out into the bitter December air. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She could sense what was about to unfold. Sophie rose eagerly, smoothing her scarf and tucking her phone away. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "He is waiting for me outside," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. Eleanor stood too, her legs stiff, her breath shallow. Together, they moved through the crowded carriage, pressed between strangers who shuffled towards the exit. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted in from the platform, mingled with the damp scent of rain-soaked stone. They stepped down onto the platform. People hurried past, their footsteps echoing against the vaulted roof. Sophie's gaze darted around, her cheeks flushed with excitement. And then she saw him. Edward. He stood a short distance away, tall in his long coat, his dark hair glistening with rain. His eyes locked onto Sophie, and in an instant his face softened. He strode forward, not towards Eleanor, not towards his wife of 12 years, but towards the girl at her side. Sophie gave a delighted cry and ran into his arms. He embraced her, pulling her close, lifting her slightly from the ground as though no one else in the world existed. His hand brushed through her hair with a tenderness Eleanor knew all too well. But what froze Eleanor's heart was the absence on his finger. The gold band, the symbol of their vows, their years together, was gone. Edward kissed Sophie's forehead, then her lips, completely unaware of Eleanor's presence only steps away. The noise of the station seemed to fade, replaced by the roar of Eleanor's blood in her ears. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. For the first time, she saw the truth not in photographs, not in whispers, but living and breathing before her eyes. Her husband was no longer hers. And he had never planned to keep it that way. The train slowed as it pulled into York Station, the lamps of the platform casting a pale golden glow through the window. Eleanor's heart hammered with dread. Sophie gathered her things, her chatter growing brighter as though the end of the journey carried a promise of joy. Eleanor followed, every step feeling heavier than the last. The winter air cut through her coat as she stepped onto the platform. Steam hissed around her boots, and the crowd surged forward with holiday anticipation. Sophie's eyes searched the throng with unmistakable eagerness. Eleanor kept to the shadows, her instincts telling her not to leave just yet. And then she saw him. Edward. He stood by the station's old clock, collar turned up against the cold, his eyes scanning until they fell on Sophie. His face softened into the smile Eleanor had not seen in months. Sophie's bag slipped from her shoulder as she ran into his arms, and he caught her effortlessly, holding her tight. The sight tore into Eleanor like glass. It was not a fleeting greeting of old friends. It was the intimate embrace of lovers. His lips brushed Sophie's hair. His hand lingered at her back in the way he once touched Eleanor when they were newlywed. And there, upon his hand, the most damning detail, his wedding ring was gone. Eleanor gripped the iron railing, struggling to breathe. She wanted to cry out, to demand answers, but her voice remained trapped in her throat. Around her, passengers bustled with luggage and laughter, oblivious to the silent devastation happening at the edge of the platform. Sophie pulled away, beaming up at Edward, and he tucked her hand into his arm as though she belonged there. They walked together towards the exit, their bodies close, speaking in whispers Eleanor could not hear. Her knees trembled, yet she forced herself to follow at a distance, weaving through the crowd. She needed proof beyond this vision, proof stronger than her breaking heart. Because what she had seen was not a misunderstanding. It was betrayal laid bare beneath the lights of York Station. And still, Edward had no idea his wife had witnessed everything. The inn staircase creaked as Edward and Sophie climbed, their laughter soft and low. Eleanor followed at a careful distance, her shoes silent on the worn carpet. Every step upward was a battle between rage and despair. At the landing, Edward paused to kiss Sophie's temple before unlocking the door at the end of the corridor. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. She watched as they slipped inside, the door shutting with a dull click that echoed through her bones. She stood alone in the dim corridor, staring at the polished brass number fixed to their room. Her hand trembled as it hovered near the doorknob. A voice in her head screamed to throw it open, to tear the illusion apart and confront the truth. Another voice urged her to turn back, to escape before the sight seared itself deeper into her memory. The muffled sound of laughter leaked through the door. Sophie's voice, light and playful. Edward's, lower, tender, the same tone he once used when whispering promises into Eleanor's ear. The sound hollowed her. Her fingers brushed the cool wood. She imagined barging in, the shock on their faces, the lies collapsing. Yet she froze, unable to move. The humiliation weighed heavy, pinning her to the spot. She felt not like a wife, but an intruder in her own marriage. A chambermaid passed with fresh linen, glancing at Eleanor with curiosity. Eleanor turned away, her cheeks burning, and hurried back down the stairs before anyone could ask why she lingered. In the lobby, she sank into a shadowed corner, her hands pressed to her face. The inn's hearth crackled nearby, indifferent to her torment. She had seen enough to know. Edward was not working late. Edward was not hers alone. He was living two lives, and Sophie was part of the one she was never meant to discover. But as Eleanor sat trembling, her eyes fell on the counter where the innkeeper kept a register. A thick book of names, each guest recorded in careful ink. Her heart stirred. Proof. If Edward had signed his name, it would be there. Her pain sharpened into resolve. She rose, smoothed her dress, and crossed the room. The innkeeper busied himself with polishing glasses behind the counter, hardly noticing Eleanor as she approached. The ledger lay open upon the desk, its thick pages filled with elegant loops of ink. Her fingers hovered above the paper, her pulse pounding in her ears. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning down the neat lines of names. Travelers from York, merchants from Leeds, a family on holiday from Durham. And then, there it was. Edward Whitcomb. The letters were unmistakable, his handwriting as familiar to her as her own. He had written it boldly, without hesitation, as though he had nothing to hide. But there was more. Just beneath his name, written in the same hand, was another. Sophie Harland. Eleanor's breath caught. They had not even bothered with pretense. Husband and wife. The ledger carried their lie in permanent ink, as binding as any vow. She pressed her gloved hand against the counter to steady herself, her vision blurring. The innkeeper glanced up at her, his brows knitting with concern. "Are you quite well, madam?" he asked. Eleanor forced a smile, shaking her head. "Yes, I am fine. Merely, waiting for someone." Her voice trembled, but the man seemed satisfied and returned to his work. Eleanor turned away quickly, clutching the memory of the names seared into her mind. There was no longer any room for doubt. She stepped outside into the biting night. Snow had begun to fall, thin flakes settling on her lashes. The street was quiet now, save for the distant toll of a church bell. She pulled her coat tighter around her, but nothing could shield her from the cold inside. The truth was written, black upon white. Edward belonged not only to her. He belonged to Sophie as well, and he had chosen to make it so in the open, without fear of discovery. But Eleanor had discovered it. And she was not done yet. Snow thickened as midnight drew near. Eleanor lingered in the shadows across from the inn, the glow of its windows spilling onto the street like a cruel invitation. Every nerve in her body screamed to act, to end the torment of waiting. At last, when the door opened and Edward stepped outside, she found her strength. He did not see her at first. He pulled his coat tighter, his breath misting in the cold. A moment later, Sophie appeared, her cheeks flushed with warmth and joy, slipping her hand into his as though it were the most natural thing in the world. That was when Eleanor moved. She stepped forward, the crunch of snow beneath her boots drawing their attention. Edward froze. His eyes widened as though he were staring at a ghost. Sophie looked from him to Eleanor, confusion dawning across her face. "Edward," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady, "will you explain this to me? Or shall I let her do it for you?" Edward stammered, words failing him. His hand dropped from Sophie's as if it had burned him. Sophie frowned, searching Eleanor's face. "Who are you?" Sophie asked. Eleanor's gaze did not falter. "I am his wife." The silence that followed was deafening. The distant bell tower struck the quarter hour, each chime hammering into Edward's shame. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Edward reached out as though to plead, but Eleanor stepped back, denying him even that comfort. "You have lied to us both," she whispered, her breath trembling in the icy air. "2 lives. 2 vows. And you thought neither of us would discover the other." Edward tried to speak, but his words were drowned by the sound of a passing carriage. Sophie turned on him, her expression torn between betrayal and disbelief. Eleanor saw in her face the same wound that tore through her own heart. For the first time, Edward stood stripped of his charm, his excuses, his carefully woven lies. And Eleanor, though broken, felt the first flicker of something else, clarity. The night around them seemed to hold its breath. The snow fell silently, waiting, as though the whole city stood witness to the moment Edward Whitcomb's double life came undone.